So let's now deploy our application and let's dive into all these pain points, all these areas which I outlined over the last course lectures. As I mentioned, I will use AWS, the Amazon Web Services, for hosting, and therefore if you want to follow along there, you need to create an AWS account. That's free, but you will need a credit card. If you don't have a credit card, you can't follow along here. You can, of course, then look into other deployment options, other providers, which might not require a credit card. Though, of course, once you deploy an application, it's very likely that at some point people want a credit card because often it costs money, or, as in the case of AWS, it could cost money depending on what you do. Speaking of that, always, of course, check out the pricing if you plan on really using a provider for hosting. AWS has the so-called free tier, which means that if you're just signing up with a new account for the first time, you get a lot of services for free, up to a certain contingent always, so there always will be a limit from which on it costs money, and also not all services are free, but you find all the details on this page. What I'm showing you here will be free as long as this is the first time you create the account, but you always should check back here to avoid unexpected and unwanted costs. Now with that, that's the service we'll use, so you should make sure that you do log in there. And once you did log in, you will see something like this. The exact look of this console changes from time to time, but it will be something like this. Now, before we dive into this AWS Management Console, though, we got a couple of things we have to do on our project. And with that, I mean this blog project, because that will be the project we will be working on here. Now, for example, we'll have to decide on the database. I outlined the different thoughts that go into this in the last lectures, and for the moment, I will stick to SQLite, but I will later show you how you can use a different database solution, PostgreSQL specifically, as an alternative. We will also have to figure out how to work with our uploaded and static files, because I mentioned that those wouldn't be served automatically. So that's something we'll also have to work on. And we're going to dive into the settings again, because there we'll also need to revisit certain aspects. And that's the part I want to start with. This settings.py file contains all the main settings for your project. The default settings here often are perfectly fine and don't need to be changed, but there are some settings you should definitely have another look at. For example, this secret key. This secret key is used internally by Django for signing cookies and for security relevant aspects in general. It generated a key automatically when we created our project, and your key will look different than my key here. And this key should be a long string, at least 32 characters, and it should be random. You also should keep it secret. Now I'm showing my key to you here, but I won't use this application anywhere, so that's no problem. But you should keep your key secret. Especially if you're also using some version control system like Git, you want to make sure that if you push your code to GitHub in a repository where other people can see it, you should not include secret data like this. Instead, consider using environment variables, which is something I'll dive into in just a second. We also now want to set debug to false here for deployment. It even says it here. We don't want to run in production with debug set to true. Because with debug set to true, we get more information if things go wrong, we get more detailed error output, and we typically don't want to show such information to third-party visitors. We want to keep that to ourselves. So we want to set debug to false here for production. Also important will be the allowed hosts. Here we'll have to add the host, so the domain, under which we later host our application. So we should add that here, and that's also something I'll come back to. Of course, you should also double check that your installed apps and your middleware is all set up correctly, but the defaults typically should work here. Make sure that your app is added here, and then, unless you really know what you're doing, you should keep all the Django apps and all the Django middleware in place as well. Now, this here also should be kept like this, the root URL config. Only change this if you changed your root project folder name in here, or if you changed the URL's PY name. Otherwise, keep it like this. And of course, also keep the templates as they are. I'll also keep this WSGI application key as it is. Now, the database settings, these are settings which we'll keep like this for the moment, but which we will change later on in this section once we move to a different database. We want to keep our auth password validator settings like this, unless you have a reason for changing them. And we can also keep all the settings down there like they are. In general, you can always check out the official Django settings documentation to learn all the details about all possible settings. Now, that's a super long list, and as I said, generally all the defaults will work for you. These settings are not even all added to the settings.py file, but you could add them if you need to override some default here. And in the official docs, you always learn what the default is and what this setting does. So that can be worth a second look if you're building a bigger application and you might have certain aspects which you need to fine-tune to your exact requirements. Generally, the defaults should work also here, but you can look up the official docs. Now, we got some settings down there related file uploads or user-generated files and static files. And I will come back to these settings in the next lecture when we talk about serving static files, because I did already mention that this would become important.